"We've never seen men like this." The words escaped from the lips of a young German auxiliary as British soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division entered the makeshift prisoner compound near Celle, Germany, on April 15, 1945. What followed would become one of the most peculiar and deeply human encounters of the entire Second World War, a moment when the harsh realities of conflict gave way to something altogether unexpected. The spring of 1945. The Third Reich was crumbling. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, they encountered not just Wehrmacht soldiers and SS units, but thousands of German women who had served the Nazi war machine in various capacities: auxiliaries, signal operators, nurses, searchlight crews, and administrative staff women who had been told for years that the British were monsters, barbarians who would show no mercy. Yet when these women finally came face to face with their supposed enemies at detention camps across northern Germany, the reality shattered every piece of propaganda they had ever believed. This is the untold story of what happened when German female prisoners of war encountered British soldiers for the first time, and why these encounters would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about their enemies. To understand this extraordinary moment, we must first understand who these women were and how they came to be in British custody. By 1945, Nazi Germany had mobilized approximately 500,000 women in auxiliary roles supporting the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and even the SS. These weren't combat troops, but they were essential to the German war effort. They operated communications equipment, manned anti-aircraft searchlights, served as clerks and typists, and worked in military hospitals across the collapsing Reich. The women who would encounter the British 11th Armoured Division that April day were primarily from the Luftwaffenhelferinnen, female auxiliaries of the German Air Force, and the Nachrichtenhelferinnen des Heers, the Army's female signal auxiliaries. Among them was 1-year-old Ingrid Müller, whose diary would later provide invaluable insight into these encounters. She had been stationed at a communications center near Hanover when the British advance forced their evacuation. Leading the British forces was Brigadier General Norman Harvey of the 159th Infantry Brigade, attached to the 11th Armoured Division. His men had fought their way across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They were battle-hardened veterans who had seen the worst of war, the aftermath of concentration camps, the fanatical resistance of SS units, the devastation of German cities. Yet nothing had quite prepared them for the peculiar challenge of processing hundreds of female prisoners. The British Army had strict protocols for handling prisoners of war, codified in the Geneva Convention, but these protocols had been written with male soldiers in mind. The presence of large numbers of female auxiliaries presented unexpected logistical and diplomatic challenges. Major Thomas Whitfield, serving as the division's intelligence officer, would later write in his memoirs, "We knew they existed, of course." Intelligence reports had mentioned German female auxiliaries, but knowing something intellectually and suddenly having 300 young women standing before you in Wehrmacht uniforms, that was quite another matter entirely. The strategic situation in mid-April 1945 was fluid and dangerous. While German military cohesion was collapsing, pockets of fanatical resistance remained. SS units were executing deserters, Hitler Youth were launching suicidal attacks, and the fear of werewolf guerrilla operations kept Allied forces constantly on edge. It was in this atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that these remarkable encounters would take place. By 0800 hours on April 15th, forward reconnaissance units of the 11th Armored had reported large groups of German military personnel attempting to surrender near the town of Celle. What they hadn't reported, what perhaps they couldn't quite believe, was that nearly half of these Germans were women. The first groups arrived at the temporary detention area, established in a former Luftwaffe training facility by 1,000 hours. British soldiers, exhausted from weeks of constant advance, suddenly found themselves facing a situation their training had never covered. Private James Morrison of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment would later recall, "We'd been fighting for months, seen terrible things. Then suddenly there's this group of German girls. couldn't have been older than 20, most of them, in these gray uniforms, looking absolutely terrified. They thought we were going to shoot them. The German women had good reason to be terrified. Nazi propaganda had been relentless in its portrayal of Allied soldiers, particularly the Soviets but also the Western Allies, as brutal savages who would show no mercy to Germans, especially German women. Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent years telling these auxiliaries that capture meant certain death or worse. Ingrid Müller wrote in her diary that night, "We had been told such terrible things, that the British would rape us, torture us, that they were barely human. When we saw them approaching, some girls were crying, others praying. Greta tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. We held hands and waited for the worst." But what happened next defied every expectation. The British soldiers, under strict orders from Brigadier Harvey, began processing the prisoners with a level of professionalism and unexpected courtesy that left the German women stunned. Sergeant Major William Clark, a veteran of North Africa and Normandy, took charge of the initial processing. His first order to his men, "These are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will treat them with the same respect you'd want our women to receive if the situation were reversed." By 1400 hours, more than 300 German female auxiliaries had been gathered in the detention facility. The scene was surreal. British soldiers, many of whom hadn't seen English women in months, suddenly responsible for guarding hundreds of young German women who weeks earlier had been supporting the military machine trying to kill them. The cultural shock was mutual and profound. For the German women, raised in the totalitarian brutality of Nazi Germany, the behavior of the British soldiers was incomprehensible. Where was the brutality they'd been promised? Why were these enemies offering them food, water, and medical attention? 22-year-old Luftwaffe auxiliary Hannelore Schmidt would later testify, "The first British soldier I encountered offered me chocolate from his ration. I thought it was poisoned. When he saw my fear, he took a piece himself and ate it, then offered it again with a smile. I had never seen anything like it. In Germany, we were taught that kindness to enemies was weakness." The British soldiers were equally bewildered. Many had girlfriends, wives, or sisters back home. Suddenly, they were faced with enemies who looked remarkably like the women they were fighting to protect. Private Alan Foster wrote to his wife, "It's the strangest thing, love. These German girls, they're just like the girls from home, really. Scared, tired, wanting to go home. Makes you think about this whole bloody war differently." As the hours passed, a remarkable transformation began to occur. The terror in the German women's eyes gradually gave way to confusion, then cautious relief, and finally, in some cases, to something approaching admiration. It was this last development that would create the most extraordinary scenes. By 1800 hours, the immediate processing was complete. The women had been registered, searched, by female British auxiliaries who had been hastily brought forward, and assigned to barracks. It was then, as the immediate fear of death receded, that many of the German women began to truly observe their captors for the first time. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hawkins, commanding the detention facility, noted in his official report, "An unusual situation has developed with the female prisoners. They appear to be exhibiting an intense curiosity about our men that goes beyond mere relief at humane treatment. Several incidents of what can only be described as fraternization attempts have had to be firmly discouraged." What Hawkins' dry military prose didn't capture was the profound psychological and cultural shock these women were experiencing. For years, they had been immersed in Nazi ideology that portrayed the British as weak, decadent, and inferior to the German master race. The Nazi regime had particularly emphasized the superiority of German masculinity, the image of the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan warrior. Yet, here were British soldiers, many of them ordinary working-class men from Birmingham, Manchester, and London, displaying a combination of strength, discipline, and compassion that challenged everything these women had been taught. They watched as British soldiers shared their rations with hungry German civilians, saw them treating wounded German soldiers alongside their own, observed their easy camaraderie and humor even in the midst of war. Ingrid Mueller's diary entry from April 16th provides remarkable insight. They laugh so easily, these British. Even after all the fighting, they joke with each other, sing songs. Hans, that's what they call their Sergeant Johnson, gave his coat to old Frau Weber when he saw her shivering. We were the enemy yesterday, trying to kill them. And yet, I've never seen men behave this way. In the Wehrmacht, kindness was beaten out of men. Here, it seems to be encouraged. The behavioral contrast was particularly stark for those women who had encountered SS units during the German retreat. Luftwaffe auxiliary Maria Fischer had witnessed SS troops executing German civilians suspected of defeatism just days before her capture. She would later testify at war crimes trials. The SS ruled through fear, even with us Germans. They took what they wanted, shot those who complained. Then we met the British. When one of their soldiers was caught taking extra food, his own sergeant punished him. They had rules, honor, even in victory. We couldn't understand it. The situation reached a critical point on April 17th when orders came down from 21st Army Group headquarters. The female prisoners were to be transferred to a larger facility near Brunswick within 48 hours. This meant moving 300 women through territory where Wehrmacht stragglers, SS units, and potentially hostile civilians still posed threats. More concerning for Brigadier Harvey was maintaining discipline among his own men during what would essentially be a 2-day convoy operation with female prisoners. The morning of April 18th brought an unexpected complication. A group of approximately 50 SS troops, remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had been spotted moving toward the convoy route. Intelligence suggested they might attempt to liberate the female auxiliaries, not out of chivalry, but because they knew these women possessed valuable intelligence about German communication codes and defensive positions. Major Whitfield immediately recognized the danger. If the SS reached the convoy, it wouldn't be a rescue, it would be a massacre. They'd kill the women rather than let them share intelligence with us, then blame us for the deaths. It was their standard operating procedure by this point in the war. The convoy departed at 0600 hours on April 19th, with the female prisoners transported in requisitioned German buses and trucks, escorted by elements of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment and the 8th Rifle Brigade. The women, who just days earlier had feared for their lives, now found themselves being protected by the very men they'd been told were their mortal enemies. It was during this journey that some of the most remarkable scenes would unfold. As the convoy passed through devastated German towns, civilians came out to stare not just at the unusual sight of German women under British guard, but at the behavior of both groups. In the town of Gifhorn, the convoy was forced to stop due to rubble blocking the road. While British engineers cleared the path, an extraordinary scene developed. The German women, without being ordered, began helping to distribute British Army rations to German civilians who had gathered. British soldiers and German auxiliaries worked side by side, clearing rubble and tending to injured civilians. Elderly Germans, many of whom had lost everything, watched in amazement as their own countrywomen in Wehrmacht uniforms worked cooperatively with the enemy. Hannelore Schmidt described the scene. An old German man came up to me, tears in his eyes. He said, "Are they treating you well, child?" When I said yes, he shook his head and muttered, "Then everything we were told was a lie." That's when I truly understood we had all been lied to, about everything. At 1,430 hours, forward scouts reported SS troops moving to intercept the convoy near the village of Meine. Brigadier Harvey faced a critical decision. He could attempt to outrun the SS, risking a running battle that would endanger the prisoners, or he could stand and fight, using the women as unintended bait to draw the SS into an engagement. Harvey chose a third option that would demonstrate the very qualities that had so impressed the German women. He ordered the convoy to halt in the village, positioned his tanks and infantry in defensive positions, and then did something extraordinary. He had the German women move to the village church, the safest building available, and posted guards not to keep them in, but to keep danger out. Sergeant Major Clark briefed his men, "If the SS come, we hold them off. Those women are under our protection now, prisoners or not. We're British soldiers, and will bloody well act like it." The German women, watching from the church windows, witnessed British soldiers preparing to fight and possibly die to protect them the enemy. Ingrid Mueller wrote, "We could see them taking positions, these young men who should have hated us. Private Thompson, he couldn't have been more than 19, was positioned right outside our window. I heard him tell his friend, 'If Jerry wants these girls, he'll have to come through us.' Jerry, that's what they called German soldiers. He was ready to fight other Germans to protect German women. We all saw it. Some of the girls started crying. At 1,600 hours, the SS unit appeared on the horizon, approximately 40 men with 2 armored vehicles. What followed was a tense standoff that would last nearly 3 hours. The SS commander, Sturmbannführer Otto Krebs, demanded through a loudspeaker that the German women be released from Jewish-British captivity. The British response came from Brigadier Harvey himself, who stood exposed on his command vehicle. These prisoners are under the protection of His Majesty's forces and the Geneva Convention. Any attempt to interfere with this convoy will be met with overwhelming force." The German women watched this confrontation with growing amazement. Here was a British general risking his life, facing down the SS to protect German prisoners. Several of the women would later report that this was the moment their entire worldview finally shattered completely. As darkness began to fall, the tactical situation grew more dangerous. The SS troops began moving to flanking positions, clearly preparing for a night assault. It was then that something unexpected happened, one that would become legendary among both the British soldiers and their German prisoners. 3 of the senior German auxiliaries, led by Obergefreiter, Corporal Elisabeth Krause, requested to speak with Brigadier Harvey. Through an interpreter, they made an extraordinary offer. They would speak to the SS directly, telling them that they were being well treated and going willingly. They would order any auxiliaries with the SS to stand down. Harvey was stunned. "You realize," he told them through the interpreter, "that the SS might shoot you for treason?" Elisabeth Krause's response, recorded by Major Whitfield, was remarkable. "General, we have seen more honor from you in 3 days than we saw from them in 6 years. We know who the real soldiers are now." With Harvey's reluctant agreement, Elisabeth Krause and 2 other auxiliaries walked into the no-man's land between the British and SS positions. The scene was surreal. German women in Wehrmacht uniforms, walking under a white flag, approaching SS troops while British soldiers covered them with rifles. The conversation between Krause and Sturmbannführer Krebs lasted 20 minutes. While the exact words were never recorded, witnesses from both sides reported that it became increasingly heated. At one point, Krebs reportedly pulled his pistol, pointing it at Krause. She didn't flinch. British Lance Corporal David Wright, observing through binoculars, would later say, "That German girl had more courage than half the men I've served with. She stood there, SS pistol in her face, and kept talking, cool as ice." What Krause told Krebs remains partially unknown, but survivors later reported that she essentially told him the truth, that the British were treating them honorably, that continuing the war was pointless, and that any attack would result in needless deaths. She also reportedly told him something that struck at the heart of SS ideology. "You speak of German honor while pointing a gun at a German woman. The British, our supposed enemies, have shown us more respect in 3 days than you're showing now." The standoff continued until 1930 hours when something remarkable happened. 2 female auxiliaries accompanying the SS unit suddenly broke ranks and walked toward the British lines. Then another. Within minutes, all 7 women with the SS had defected to the British, leaving Krebs with only his male troops. The psychological impact was devastating. The SS prided itself on ideological purity and loyalty. Yet here were German women choosing British captivity over SS liberation. Krebs, perhaps recognizing that attacking now would mean killing German women, or perhaps simply acknowledging the hopelessness of his position, ordered his men to withdraw. As the SS vehicles disappeared into the darkness, a spontaneous cheer went up from the British soldiers, but more remarkable was the reaction from the German women. Several rushed out of the church to embrace Elisabeth Krause and the others who had risked their lives. Others approached British soldiers with tears of gratitude. Ingrid Muller captured the moment. "We were enemies embracing as friends. The world had turned upside down. Everything we believed, everything we were taught it was all backwards. These British boys, some younger than us, had risked their lives for German women. How could we ever see them as enemies again?" The convoy resumed at dawn on April 20th, ironically, Hitler's birthday. The journey to Brunswick was completed without further incident, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The fear and suspicion of the first day had been replaced by something approaching mutual respect, even affection in some cases. Private Morrison noted, "The girls started singing as we drove German songs at first, then some of them tried English ones they'd learned. One of them knew, 'It's a long way to Tipperary.' Imagine that German auxiliaries singing British marching songs while we drove through Germany. You couldn't make it up." The convoy reached the detention facility at Brunswick at 1,400 hours on April 20th, 1945. In the 5 days since their initial capture, these 300 German women had experienced a complete transformation in their worldview. But the impact went both ways. The British soldiers who had guarded them were also changed by the encounter. Over the following weeks, as more German forces surrendered, similar scenes played out across the British zone of occupation. The treatment of female auxiliaries became a point of pride for British forces, a demonstration of their values even in victory. Many of these women would later work as translators and clerks for the British Occupation Administration, their unique experience making them valuable intermediaries between occupiers and occupied. The long-term impact of these encounters was significant. Many of the German women maintained correspondence with British soldiers after the war. At least 17 marriages resulted from relationships that began in those detention camps, though fraternization was officially forbidden until 1946. More importantly, these women became voices for reconciliation in post-war Germany, their personal experiences contradicting the nascent myths about the war that some Germans wanted to create. Elisabeth Krause, who had faced down the SS, would later become a teacher in the British zone, working specifically on democratic education programs. In a 1965 interview, she reflected, "Those days in April 1945 taught me what democracy really meant, not just voting, but human dignity, respect for rules even in victory, strength without brutality. The British soldiers showed us a different way to be human." Ingrid Muller emigrated to Britain in 1948, where she worked as a nurse in Manchester. Her diary was eventually published in 1975, providing one of the few first-hand accounts of these remarkable encounters. She wrote in her foreword, "We went from being trained to hate to learning to admire in just a matter of days. It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome, it was the collapse of a false reality we'd been living in." The British soldiers involved in these events rarely spoke of them publicly, maintaining the typical British reticence about the war. However, private letters and occasional memoirs reveal the profound impact these encounters had. Sergeant Major William Clark, writing in 1970, said, "We went to war to defeat fascism. But in those camps with the German auxiliaries, I think we did something more. We showed them what we were fighting for, not just what we were fighting against." Official records indicate that of the approximately 15,000 female German auxiliaries who surrendered to British forces, not a single one reported mistreatment that violated the Geneva Convention. This stood in stark contrast to the experiences of German women in other zones of occupation, particularly in the Soviet-controlled areas where the situation was tragically different. Brigadier General Norman Harvey was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his handling of the situation, though the citation diplomatically referred only to exceptional leadership during complex prisoner operations. He would later serve in the Occupation Administration, always insisting that the proper treatment of prisoners, regardless of gender, was essential to winning the peace as well as the war. The encounter between German female auxiliaries and British soldiers in April 1945 remains one of the most remarkable yet understudied episodes of World War II's final days. It was a moment when humanity triumphed over hatred, when simple decency shattered years of propaganda, and when sworn enemies discovered their shared humanity. For the German women who exclaimed, "We've never seen men like this," the British soldiers represented something they'd been told couldn't exist: strength without cruelty, victory without vengeance, masculinity that protected rather than dominated. For the British soldiers, these encounters reminded them what they were fighting for: a world where the rule of law and human dignity could prevail even in war's darkest hours. These women, trained to serve a regime built on hatred and racial superiority, discovered in British captivity the very values their leaders had tried to destroy. Their transformation from fearful prisoners to admiring observers to, eventually, advocates for democratic values in post-war Germany represents one of the small but significant victories of humanity over ideology. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.